The church doors had never been so quiet in all of Dusty Creek, Texas. Clayton Atkins stood at the altar with his hat pressed flat against his chest, his sun-darkened jaw set like iron, his dark eyes fixed on the woman walking toward him in a dress the color of winter cream. Every soul in that chapel held their breath. Every candle flame seemed to pause. The wooden pews were packed with ranchers and shopkeepers, with wives fanning themselves in the July heat, with children who had been shushed into confused silence, all of them watching the most impossible thing any of them had ever seen unfold right there between two whitewashed walls and a crooked wooden cross. Because standing at the front of that altar, position where a groom was supposed to stand, was not Clayton Atkins alone. There were two men. Reverend Dale Prout, a thin man with wire spectacles and shaking hands, looked back and forth between them like a man watching a rattlesnake try to decide which boot to strike. On one side was Clayton, 32 years old, broad-shouldered, the most prosperous cattleman in 4 counties, a man who had built an empire from cracked earth and sheer will. And on the other side, freshly arrived on the morning stage from San Antonio, was Gerald Whitmore, pale-suited, gold-toothed, smelling of bay rum and claiming, loudly and with considerable legal documentation, that Mae Harper was already promised to him by a contract signed 3 years ago by her late father. Mae had stopped walking. She stood halfway down the aisle, her bouquet of dried wildflowers trembling in both hands, her brown eyes moving from one man to the other with an expression that split open every heart in the room. She was not a woman who showed weakness easily. Everyone in Dusty Creek knew that about Mae Harper. She had run her father's dry goods store alone for 2 years after his death, kept the books, haggled with suppliers, survived a drought that had broken lesser people. But right now, in this moment, she looked like a woman who had just learned that the ground beneath her feet was not solid at all, that it had never been solid, that everything she believed she had chosen freely had been arranged without her knowledge. Gerald Whitmore straightened his collar and spoke first. "Miss Harper, I have ridden 2 days to honor this contract. Your father was a man of his word, and I expect you are too." The silence that followed was so complete that the distant lowing of cattle from Clayton's herd, grazing a quarter-mile outside of town, could be heard through the single open window. And then Clayton Atkins turned away from Gerald Whitmore entirely, as though the man were nothing more than a fence post that needed clearing, and he looked at me, only me, and he said in a voice low and steady and full of something that had been gathering for a very long time, "Me, you know where I stand. You have always known where I stand, and I want every person in this room to understand something." He paused, and the pause was worth 10 years of silence. I would have waited another 10 years for her. The words landed like a thunderclap in dry air, and that was when Gerald Whitmore made the mistake of laughing. The story of how 3 people came to stand in that small church on a blazing July morning in 1878 began much further back, in the kind of quiet suffering that never makes noise because the people enduring it are too proud, too busy, or too afraid to ask for anything different. Mae Harper had come to Dusty Creek, Texas, with her father, Thomas Harper, in the spring of 1873, when she was 23 years old and the grief of her mother's passing in Missouri was still fresh enough to taste. Thomas Harper was a wiry, restless man with the kind of optimism that either built towns or buried men, and he had read an advertisement in a St. Louis newspaper about the booming commerce potential of the cattle trail towns of central Texas, and had taken it as a divine instruction. He loaded everything they owned into a wagon, and they drove west into the kind of country that does not apologize for its harshness. Dusty Creek in 1873 was not much. It was a post office, a saloon, a livery, a handful of buildings that huddled together along a single dirt street as if for warmth, and the beginning of something larger, the cattle drives passing through on their way north to the railheads in Kansas had started to bring money and men and the slow architecture of permanence. Thomas Harper saw all of this and opened his dry goods store in a rented building on the main street, stocked it with flour and nails and fabric and lamp oil and the thousand small necessities of frontier life, and within a year it was modestly successful. Mae worked alongside her father from the first day. She was good with numbers and better with people, and she had a quality that the cattle drivers and the ranch hands and the homesteaders all responded to, which was that she treated every person who came through the door as though their business mattered. Not in a false way, not in the way of a woman performing politeness, but genuinely because she found people interesting, their problems interesting, their stubbornness and their humor and their particular way of surviving interesting. She met Clayton Atkins for the first time in the late summer of 1873, about 6 months after arriving. He came into the store on a Tuesday afternoon, dusty from the range and accompanied by 2 cowhands, and he asked for a specific type of harness buckle that Thomas had not yet stocked. Thomas was out back at the time, and Mae handled it, explaining what she could order and when it would arrive and what the cost would be. Clayton listened with the focused attention of a man who was accustomed to getting information efficiently and making decisions quickly. He had a lean, hard quality to him even then, at 27, though the hardness was not cruelty but competence. It was the look of a man who had survived things and kept moving. He came back the following week for the buckles. He paid, he thanked her, he left. Mae did not think much of it except that he was precise and honest in his dealings, which in a cattle town was worth more than good looks, though he had those too. The third time he came in, he bought a pound of coffee and a box of cartridges, neither of which required any discussion, but he stood at the counter for 10 minutes anyway, asking me about where she had come from and what she thought of Texas. Mae answered him with her characteristic directness, telling him she found the land overwhelming and somewhat beautiful, and that she was not yet sure whether it was a place she could love or only a place she could endure. He had said with the ghost of a smile that he had felt the same way for about 5 years before the land won. He kept coming back. It was not a courtship in any formal sense, not at first. Clayton Atkins was not a man who operated in formal registers. He was a working cattleman with 1,000 acres and a growing herd, and a team of hired men who required his attention from before dawn until after dark, and he did not have the leisure for the kind of careful, stepwise courtship that gentler times and gentler places allowed for. What he had was consistent presence and undivided attention, and in its own way, that was more powerful than flowers. Over the months, Mae began to notice things about him. She noticed that he paid his accounts on time and settled his debts before they were even asked for. She noticed that he treated his cowhands with a respect that was not common in that era or that place, that he knew their names and their families, and whether they had been sick, and that when a man named Pedro Garza broke his leg in a branding accident, Clayton kept paying his wages for the 2 months it took him to recover. She noticed that he had built his ranch house with 2 extra bedrooms for no apparent reason, which struck her as the act of a man who was thinking about a future that was not yet visible. What she did not let herself notice, or rather, what she carefully declined to examine, was that her days felt different when he came in. Brighter, more immediate, as though the store and its familiar smells of oiled wood and dried goods and fresh fabric were more alive when he was standing in it. Her father noticed instead. Thomas Harper was not a subtle man, and one evening in the spring of 1874, after Clayton had spent the better part of an hour discussing, with Mae, a question about whether she thought the extension of the rail line through their part of Texas would help or hurt the cattle trade, her father waited until Clayton had gone, and then looked at his daughter across the supper table with the expression of a man about to do something he knew might be unwise. "That cattleman is courting you," Thomas said. "He is buying supplies," Mae said. "He bought 1 tin of tobacco and talked to you for an hour about railroad economics. Mae, I was not always old." Mae had not answered, which was its own kind of answer. Thomas Harper let the matter rest for a time, but he had a secret that he was carrying, a dark weight he had brought with him from Missouri and had never yet laid down, and it was pressing harder on him as his health began, quietly and without drama, to fail. He had been coughing since winter. He told me it was the dust. He told himself it was the dust. But by the summer of 1875, when the coughing had deepened and his energy had become unreliable, he began to consider the future with the urgency of a man who can hear the clock ticking. Thomas Harper was in debt, not ruinously but significantly. When he had sold his shop and his house in Missouri and bought the wagon and the supplies and the Texas storefront, he had borrowed money from a man in San Antonio named Edmund Whitmore, the father of Gerald Whitmore, a moneylender of the kind that made sure all his contracts were enforceable and all his interest rates were just barely legal. The debt had been manageable while business was good. But a drought in 1874 had reduced the cattle traffic through Dusty Creek considerably, and Thomas had used most of his savings to keep the store stocked and his accounts with suppliers current, and the debt to Edmund Whitmore had grown rather than shrunk. Edmund Whitmore had come to Dusty Creek in person that August, a large, formally dressed man who smelled of money and legal documents. He and Thomas had a long conversation in the back room of the store, while Mae was behind the counter, unaware. The terms that emerged from that conversation were never fully told to me. What Thomas told her afterward was only that he had arranged to restructure the debt and that it was nothing to worry about. What Thomas had actually agreed to, under pressure that walked the line between persuasion and coercion, was a contract binding me to a future marriage with Edmund Whitmore's son Gerald, contingent on Thomas's death and Gerald's desire to enforce the agreement. In exchange, the debt would be forgiven. Edmund Whitmore had framed it as a business arrangement between families, the kind of thing that had been done for centuries, and Thomas, terrified of leaving me alone and indebted, had signed. He told himself he would tell her. He kept not telling her. Clayton Atkins, in the meantime, had no knowledge of any of this. He was building a ranch. He was expanding his herd. He was becoming, acre by acre and head by head, one of the most prosperous men in that part of Texas. And he was, with the slow but absolute certainty of a man who does not give his heart easily and therefore cannot give it back once it is given, falling in love with Mae Harper. He was not blind to the complications. He had asked around about her, as a man did in those times, and he knew she was a serious woman with no patience for performance. He also knew that whatever she felt about him, she held it close, the way she held most things close. Mae Harper was not cold. She was careful. There was a difference, and Clayton understood it because he was the same way. He began to show her what he could, not with words because he was not naturally eloquent, but with action. He brought the business of the ranch exclusively to Harper's store. He recommended her to other ranchers. When a Comanche trading party came through town in 1875, during a period of considerable tension, and several townspeople were making noise about running them off, it was Clayton who quietly prevented it, knowing that the trade goods they carried were legitimate, and that their presence represented a kind of fragile peace that was worth protecting. He told me about it afterward, not to impress her but because he thought she would want to know, and the way she had looked at him then, steady and warm and entirely without performance, had been enough to last him for months. He had also, in the summer of 1875, begun to consider the specific question of asking Thomas Harper for permission to court me formally. He was a traditional man in some ways, and he respected the forms even when he knew the forms were often just ceremony around something that was already true. He had decided to speak to Thomas in the fall, after the drives were done. He never got the chance. Thomas Harper died in September of 1875, quietly and quickly, of a lung condition that the doctor in Dusty Creek called consumption and could do nothing about. He died in the room above the store where he and me slept, with me holding one hand and a candle burning on the nightstand, and his last coherent words to his daughter were an apology that she did not, at the time, understand. "I tried to protect you," he said. "I'm sorry I did not do it better." Mae had squeezed his hand and told him he had been a good father and that she was not afraid, and he had closed his eyes and not opened them again. She found the letter from Edmund Whitmore 3 weeks later, sorting through her father's papers. She found the contract with it. She read both documents twice before she put them down. Then she sat in her father's chair behind the store counter for a long time, looking at the wall, understanding the shape of the trap she had been placed in, the betrayal not of malice but of desperation, and feeling the particular kind of grief that comes from learning that someone you loved was more frightened than they ever told you. She did not tell Clayton about the contract. She did not tell anyone about the contract. Her reasoning was practical, or at least she told herself it was practical. The contract was between her father and Edmund Whitmore. Her father was dead. She was running the store alone now, and she was doing it competently. Edmund Whitmore was in San Antonio. Gerald Whitmore had never written her or contacted her in any way. Perhaps the contract would simply be forgotten. Perhaps it would be treated as the artifact of a transaction that could not now be enforced, since the debt it was settling had died with the man who owed it. She was wrong, but she would not know that for nearly 3 years. What she did, instead of telling the truth, was put her whole self into the store. She renegotiated her supply contracts and extended her credit carefully. She expanded her stock to include medicines and hardware items that the town had previously had to travel to buy elsewhere. She hired a young man named Tobias Reed, 17 years old and the son of a local homesteader, to help with lifting and deliveries, and she taught him the books because she believed in practical education. The store became, under her management, more successful than it had ever been under her father's. And Clayton was still there. He was still coming in, still buying what he needed, still staying longer than the purchases required. But Mae had changed in the months after her father's death, had built a careful distance between herself and anything that looked like it might require her to be fully honest about her situation. She was warm with Clayton. She was engaged and interesting and genuinely glad to see him. But whenever the conversation moved toward anything that was about the future, toward what she wanted or what she was planning, she redirected it with the practiced smoothness of someone who has been doing that particular maneuver for a long time. Clayton noticed. He was not the kind of man who pushed, but he was observant, and he knew that something had shifted in Mae after Thomas died, something beyond grief. He had the strong impression that she was protecting herself from something specific, and because he respected her, and because he was not willing to make her feel cornered, he did not press. He simply kept showing up, kept being consistent, kept letting her know by every means available to him that he was not going anywhere. There was one evening in the fall of 1876 that both of them would remember for the rest of their lives, though they never spoke of it until much later. Mae had stayed late in the store doing inventory, and Clayton had come by after a long day on the range, not to buy anything, just to drop off a bolt of fabric that had fallen from her supply wagon during delivery and had ended up near his east pasture fence. It was a small thing, a nothing thing, but he had ridden it back to her rather than leave it. She had been standing behind the counter with a lantern when he came in, and something about the lamplight and the tiredness and the gratitude of the moment had broken down her careful management of the distance between them. They had stood on opposite sides of that counter talking until nearly midnight, about nothing in particular and everything that mattered, about what it felt like to build something from nothing, about whether Texas was a place you chose or a place that chose you, about fear and stubbornness, and the strange way that grief changed a person without announcing the change. He had looked at her at one point, in the particular way he had that made her feel fully seen, and said, "I don't think I've met another person who works as hard as you do to make sure nobody knows how much they feel." Mae had gone very still. "Is that a criticism?" "No," he said. "It's an observation. I do the same thing." She had looked at him across the counter for a long moment and then said, in a voice quieter than her usual one, "What do you feel, Clayton?" And he had said just as quietly, "You know what I feel, me." She did know. That was the honest truth of it. She knew exactly what he felt, and she felt it herself with the same intensity and the same helplessness. And if she had been free, completely and unambiguously free, she would have said so right then and everything would have been different. But she was not free, or at least she was not certain she was free, and the contract was still sitting in her father's papers in the back room like an unexploded charge, and she had said instead, with the specific regret of a woman who knows exactly what she is doing and does it anyway, "I think you should go home, Clayton. It's late." He had gone. He had not been cold about it or wounded in any visible way. He had put his hat back on and said good night in the same even tone he always used, and she had watched him ride away through the store window and felt a grief so sharp it was almost indistinguishable from loss, even though he was still alive and still present and nothing had been declared or decided. She was protecting him, or trying to. She had told herself she was protecting him. Because if Gerald Whitmore ever showed up to enforce that contract, the fallout would be uglier for having included Clayton. Better to keep things unfinished. Better to keep the heart's door at an angle rather than flung open. The year 1877 moved through Dusty Creek with the particular velocity of a time that is both busy and fundamentally the same. The cattle drives were good that year, and the town had grown. A new hotel going up on the north end of the main street, a blacksmith shop expanding, a school being built for the children of the homesteading families who had been arriving in steady numbers for 3 years. Me's store was doing well enough that she was able to hire a second employee, a woman named Ruth Colby, the wife of a farmhand, who had quick hands and a talent for arrangement that made the store look better than it had before. Clayton bought the neighboring ranch that summer, adding another 800 acres to his holdings and increasing his herd by nearly a third. He was, by any measure, a successful man, and Dusty Creek respected him the way it respected all men who had built something real. He was also, quietly and without making a performance of it, becoming lonely in a way he had not been when he was younger and too busy to notice the absence of companionship. He had had an offer from a woman in Dallas, introduced to him through a mutual acquaintance, a widow named Catherine Fields, pleasant and capable and available in every practical sense. He had met her twice when business took him to Dallas. He had been genuinely cordial. He had also known, with the absolute precision that the heart sometimes allows itself, that he was not available, that he had given something to Mae Harper that he could not simply take back and redirect. He had written Mae one letter, the only letter he would ever write her before everything changed. He had written it in January of 1878 and then rewritten it 4 times before settling on a version that said, essentially, this: that he was not a man who played games, and that he had been waiting, not impatiently, not with any demand, but waiting nonetheless, for her to decide whether what was between them was worth trusting. He said he understood that she carried things she had not shared with him, and he was not asking her to justify them. He said only that she should know that he intended to ask her to marry him before the year was out, and that he wanted her to have time to think about it before he asked, because he wanted her answer to be something she had decided rather than something she was surprised into. Mae had read that letter sitting at the counter in the morning before Ruth arrived, with a cup of coffee cooling beside her, and she had felt the full weight of what she had been refusing to let herself feel for nearly 5 years. The warmth and the panic arrived simultaneously, the way they always did when she let herself face the truth of what she wanted. She had also, the day before, received a letter from Gerald Whitmore in San Antonio. Edmund Whitmore was dead. Gerald had inherited the money-lending business and all its associated contracts, and he was writing to inform me that he intended to honor the agreement made between his father and Thomas Harper. He would be coming to Dusty Creek in the spring. He expected the matter to be handled quietly and without complication. Mae had read that letter and then folded it into precise quarters and put it in the same place she kept the original contract, which was the bottom of a tin box at the back of the storeroom behind the pickled goods. She had stood very still for a few minutes, listening to the ordinary sounds of the street outside, the creak of wagon wheels and the distant bark of a dog and someone calling a name from one porch to another, and she had made a decision. She was going to fight this. She was going to find out whether the contract had any legal force. She was going to write to a lawyer in Austin and get an opinion. She was not going to tell Clayton yet because she did not yet know what she was dealing with, and she was not willing to ask him for help until she had first tried to manage this herself, because that was who she was. She wrote to the lawyer. The lawyer's response, which took 3 weeks to arrive, was not encouraging. The contract, while morally repugnant in the way that such arrangements always were, had been signed voluntarily by Thomas Harper, witnessed by 2 men who were presumably still alive in San Antonio, and was technically enforceable under Texas law as it stood in 1878. The lawyer noted, cautiously, that Mae was an adult woman who had not signed the contract herself, and that her consent would ordinarily be required for a marriage. But he also noted that the legal landscape was such that a determined man with legal resources could make her life very difficult through suits against the store and the estate, and that the practical pressure could be considerable. Mae read this and felt the specific fury of a woman who discovers that the law, which is supposed to protect her, was written by and for the benefit of people who were not her. She wrote back asking about her options. She wrote to 2 more lawyers. She got answers that ranged from mildly helpful to completely useless. The consistent thread was that she had limited legal recourse and that the most practical path was negotiation, meaning, essentially, finding some way to settle the original debt that the contract had been written to forgive. The debt had been $500 in 1875. With 3 years of Whitmore interest, it was now closer to $800. Mae did not have $800 in liquid cash. She had the store and its inventory, which was worth more than that, but she was not willing to liquidate the store, which her father had built, and which was her livelihood and the only security she had. She was still working through this problem, had been working through it for 6 weeks since Gerald's letter arrived, when Clayton Atkins appeared in her store one March morning in 1878 and stood at the counter and asked her to have supper with him on Saturday evening. It was the most direct he had ever been, and it was also the worst possible timing in the history of the universe, and Mae loved him and despised the situation in equal measure. She said yes. Not because she had decided everything was fine and the problem would resolve itself. She said yes because she had been careful and strategic and protective for years, and she was tired of managing the distance, tired of denying herself the thing she most wanted, tired of letting a contract written in a back room without her knowledge dictate the shape of her life. She said yes because she had read Clayton's letter and known that whatever happened next, she was not willing to lie to herself about her own heart any longer. They had supper at the hotel, the new one, which had a dining room with actual tablecloths, and a cook who made a beef stew that was considerably better than anything most people managed at home. Mae wore her green dress, the one she had made from fabric she had ordered from a supplier in St. Louis, and kept telling herself she was saving for a special occasion, and Clayton wore a clean shirt and his good coat, and had made some effort with his hair that she found quietly endearing. They talked for 3 hours. It was different from all the years of counter conversations, different because there was no buffer of commerce, no exchange of goods or money to give the interaction a frame. It was just 2 people sitting across a table and choosing to be there, and the choosing made everything more vivid, more present, more requiring of honesty. At some point during the second hour, over coffee and a slice of dried apple pie, Mae looked at Clayton across the table and said, with a directness that surprised them both, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything." He had set down his coffee cup and given her his full attention. She told him everything. The debt, Edmund Whitmore's visit, the contract, her father's death, the letter from Gerald, the lawyers. All of it, all the hidden motive and the dark secret and the trap she had been living with for 3 years. She laid it out plainly and without drama, in the same straightforward way she handled accounts, one fact at a time. When she finished, Clayton was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why didn't you tell me before? Because I didn't want you involved in my problem." "Me," he said, with a patience that had something very warm underneath it, "that is the most stubborn thing I have ever heard, and I spend my days with cattle." She had almost laughed. She had also been watching his face the entire time she was talking, and she had seen something there, not pity, not the withdrawal she had half feared, but a kind of focused calm that told her he was already thinking about how to fix it. "I don't need you to save me," she said. "I know you don't," he said, "but I'd like to try if you'll let me." "What I need," Mae said carefully, "is a partner, someone who treats this as our problem, not yours to solve and mine to receive the solution of." He looked at her for a moment. "That's fair," he said, "so tell me how we solve it together." That was the night everything changed between them. Not because of a declaration or a dramatic moment, though there would be those too, but because of that single exchange, the specific negotiation of what partnership meant between two people who were both accustomed to managing everything alone. Mae had laid down a condition, and Clayton had accepted it without minimizing it, and that acceptance was more intimate than any embrace. They talked through the situation for another hour. Clayton had resources she did not. He had cash, and he had a lawyer he trusted in Austin, a man named Frederick Crane who had helped him with the land acquisition the year before. He proposed that they bring Crane in immediately, that they assess the exact legal status of the contract, and that they consider the possibility of paying off the restructured debt directly, removing Whitmore's leverage entirely. Mae said she would not allow him to simply pay her debt. Clayton said he was not proposing a gift. He was proposing a loan between partners to be repaid at whatever terms she found acceptable, or, if she was willing to consider it, at the terms she and he might arrive at if she agreed to be his wife, in which case the question of whose debt it was would become substantially more complicated. Mae looked at him. "That is the least romantic way anyone has ever proposed marriage to me." "It isn't a proposal yet," he said. "It is a preliminary discussion of conditions." "You are a very unusual man, Clayton Atkins." "You are a very unusual woman, Mae Harper. I have been paying attention for 5 years." She had gone home that night with her heart hammering in her chest, and a feeling she had not allowed herself in years. A feeling that was simply hope, uncomplicated and present, the possibility that the future could be good. Frederick Crane arrived in Dusty Creek in early April 1878, summoned by a letter Clayton sent the morning after their supper. He was a compact, precise man in his 50s, with a briefcase full of Texas statutes, and a reputation for finding the leverage in situations that appeared to have none. He reviewed the contract and Gerald Whitmore's letter, and all the correspondence Mae had retained with the other lawyers, and then he sat down with Mae and Clayton together in the back room of the store while Ruth watched the counter. "The contract has problems," Crane said. "Not enough to void it outright, but enough to challenge it. Thomas Harper signed under duress, or at least under conditions that a competent lawyer could argue were coercive. The debt restructuring that preceded the signing was itself potentially usurious by Texas standards. And Miss Harper, as a party who did not sign and who was not present and who was not informed, has a strong equitable argument against enforcement." "But," Mae said, because there was clearly a but litigation takes time and costs money and is uncertain. "Gerald Whitmore has legal resources. His father built a business on contracts exactly like this one, and he knows how to defend them. A court fight would be long and expensive, and you might win and you might not." "What is the alternative?" Clayton asked. Crane adjusted his spectacles. "The most efficient resolution is to settle the underlying debt. $820 by my calculation of the interest as stated in the original agreement. You pay that, the contract becomes moot because its stated purpose, the forgiveness of debt, has been superseded. Mae was quiet. Then she said, I want to put in as much as I can. I have $340 in the bank. That leaves approximately $480, Clayton said. Which I will lend you, he said, meeting her eyes, at 0 interest, to be repaid when and as you are able. Those are the terms. That is not a business loan, Mae said. No, he agreed. It is not. There was a weighted silence. Frederick Crane found something to study on the opposite wall. All right, Mae said. Those terms. The letter to Gerald Whitmore, drafted by Crane and signed by Mae, was sent the following week. It offered full settlement of the original debt plus 3 years of stated interest, totaling $820, in exchange for the return of the original contract and a release of all claims. It noted, with precise legal language, that Miss Harper had not been party to the contract, had not consented to its terms, and that any attempt to enforce it in court would be vigorously contested on multiple grounds. Gerald Whitmore did not respond immediately. 3 weeks passed with no answer, and Mae spent those 3 weeks in a state of surface calm and subsurface dread, going about her work with the discipline of a woman who has learned that anxiety does not speed anything up. Clayton came by every few days, not pressing, not performing optimism, just being there in the way that had been his most reliable quality since she met him. She asked him once, during one of those visits, how he had learned to be so patient. He considered it. I think it was cattle, he said. You cannot rush a herd. You can push it too hard and then you have chaos. You learn to move at the pace that works or you lose what you are trying to keep. You are comparing me to a herd of cattle, Mae said. I am comparing myself to a man who knows what he is tending and is not in a hurry to ruin it, he said. She had looked at him with that particular quality she had, the full present, nothing held back look that she only gave him when she forgot to guard it, and said, Clayton, I'm not ruined. I know, he said. I am being careful with you anyway. Gerald Whitmore's response arrived in May. He was not accepting the settlement. He was coming to Dusty Creek in person. He intended to honor his father's contract, and he expected me to honor it as well. Mae read the letter and set it down with the controlled deliberateness of a woman who is very close to the edge of her composure. Then she went to find Clayton. She found him at the livery, checking over a horse that had thrown a shoe. She walked across the street and stood in the livery door and said, Whitmore is coming. He rejected the settlement. Clayton set down the horse's hoof and straightened. When? He didn't say. Soon. She paused. He said he expects me to honor the contract. He can expect whatever he likes, Clayton said. He has no legal right to force a marriage. He has legal right to make my life considerably worse, Mae said. He could sue the estate. He could challenge my title to the store. Even if I win eventually, the process could cost me everything. Clayton crossed the livery toward her. He stopped close enough that she could see the exact quality of his attention, which was complete. Mae, he said, I want to ask you to marry me. I have wanted to ask you for a long time. I want to ask you right now, and I want it to be because you want to, not because it is a solution to a legal problem. Can you tell me which one it would be? Mae was quiet for a long moment. The livery smelled of hay and horses and iron, and outside the town of Dusty Creek went about its afternoon business entirely indifferent to the most important conversation she had had in years. Both, she said honestly. It would be both. I can't separate them completely, and I don't think you should want me to lie about it. I don't want you to lie about it, he said. I want to know where we are. Where we are, Mae said, is that I love you, Clayton. I have loved you for probably 3 years, and I have been too frightened to say it because I had this hanging over me, and I didn't want you to be caught in it. And I am now going to say it plainly, and you can decide what you want to do with it. The silence in the livery was enormous. Clayton Atkins said, quietly and with absolute certainty, I love you too, Mae. I have loved you since about the same time, possibly longer, and I would like very much for you to marry me, regardless of Gerald Whitmore, regardless of the contract, regardless of any of it. but I want you to say yes because you want the life we would build together, not because you are afraid of him." "I am not afraid of him," Mae said. "I am angry at him. There is a difference." "Is that a yes?" She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. "It's a yes." He had taken both her hands in his, which were large and warm and rough from work, and had stood there in the dim livery in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, holding her hands with the careful precision of a man who understands the weight of what he is holding. They had told Reverend Prout that week. They had told Ruth and Tobias and the general community of Dusty Creek in the way that such things were told in small towns, which was that they told two people, and within 48 hours everyone knew. The response was uniformly warm, because Clayton was respected and Mae was liked, and most of the town had been watching this particular inevitability develop for years and felt personally satisfied to see it arrive. Frederick Crane, who had stayed in Dusty Creek at Clayton's request and at Clayton's expense, sent a second letter to Gerald Whitmore informing him that Mae Harper was engaged to be married to Clayton Atkins, and that any attempt to enforce the contract against her would be opposed with the full legal and financial resources of Atkins Ranch, which were, Crane noted with measured precision, considerable. He again offered the full settlement amount and suggested that accepting it was in Whitmore's best interest. Whitmore, apparently, did not agree. The wedding was set for the 12th of July. They had 6 weeks. Mae threw herself into the practical logistics with the focused energy she brought to everything, and found, to her own slight surprise, that she enjoyed it. Ruth helped her make a dress from white cotton lawn that they embroidered together in the evenings, after the store closed, tiny flowers along the hem and cuffs. And Tobias's mother contributed a length of cream-colored ribbon that had been saved for years for exactly this kind of occasion. Clayton was characteristically practical about the arrangements, securing the use of the church, providing for a celebration supper afterward, and otherwise staying out of the way of things he didn't understand and she understood better. There were several evenings in those 6 weeks that Mae would remember her whole life. One of them was a Thursday evening when Clayton came to the store at closing time with a question about the hymns for the service, and they ended up sitting on the store's front step in the long summer dusk talking about what they wanted their life to look like. Children, eventually, Mae said. 2 or 3. Clayton said he had built those extra rooms for a reason, and she laughed and said she had wondered about those rooms for years. He said he had been an optimist even when there was nothing to be optimistic about, and she said she thought that was the most revealing thing he had ever told her. He said there was more where that came from. She had leaned her head against his shoulder on that step, for just a moment, in the warm evening air, and felt the particular quality of rightness that cannot be manufactured and cannot be pretended, the bone-deep sense of having arrived somewhere you have been trying to reach for a very long time. Another evening, 10 days before the wedding, they had ridden out to the ranch together, Mae on the gentle mare Clayton kept for exactly this kind of occasion, and he had shown her all of it, the main house and the barn and the corrals and the east pasture where the land rolled away in great golden waves toward the horizon. The house was better than she had expected, solid and well-made, with a proper kitchen and a parlor with 2 windows facing east and the extra rooms he had built with such confident anticipation. He had stood in the kitchen doorway watching her look around and said, "Tell me what you want to change." "I'll need to think about it," she said. "Take all the time you want." "It's your house." She had turned from the window to look at him and said, "It's our house." The way he had smiled at that, slow and deep and with everything in it, had been better than any declaration. The night before the wedding, Mae had sat alone in the store for a while after Ruth and Tobias had gone home, looking at the counter and the shelves and the familiar geography of the place her father had built and she had kept. She felt him in it, Thomas Harper, not as a haunting but as a presence, the particular texture of his specific life. She had felt, for the first time since reading his letter to Edmund Whitmore, something like forgiveness. He had been afraid. He had been dying and afraid for his daughter, and he had made a terrible decision in a desperate moment. She had built her whole self on the foundation of his love for her, and that part was real and permanent. The decision he had made could be undone. The love could not. She blew out the lamp and locked the store and went to bed. She did not know that Gerald Whitmore had arrived in Dusty Creek on the evening stage. The morning of July the 12th was clear and blazing hot, as July mornings in central Texas in 1878 tended to be, with a sky so blue it seemed almost aggressive, and a sun that announced itself with complete authority. Me dressed in the store's back room with Ruth's help, the white lawn dress with its embroidered hem, the cream ribbon in her dark hair, and she looked at herself in the small square mirror she kept above the washstand and thought that she looked like a woman who had arrived at something she had earned. Ruth cried a little, which made me smile. Tobias, pressed into service as an escort for the short walk to the church, wore a borrowed jacket and looked both proud and terrified of doing something wrong, which me found endearing. The church was full when she arrived. Clayton was already there, standing at the altar with Reverend Prout, and even from the back of the church she could see the quality of his stillness, the particular way he stood that was not nervous but expectant, the way a man stands when he is about to receive something he has wanted for a long time. And then the doors on the side of the church opened. Gerald Whitmore walked in. He was exactly as me had imagined him from his letters, which was to say, a man who had confused wealth with authority and had organized his entire appearance to project a dominance he felt he deserved. He was perhaps 35, well-dressed, with a gold tooth that caught the light, and he was carrying a leather satchel that she recognized, from the way Crane's expression went tight when he saw it, as containing documents. He walked up the aisle and positioned himself at the altar without asking permission, because that was the kind of man he was, and he produced from his satchel the original signed contract and a document she had not seen before, which was a formal complaint filed with the county court challenging me's legal status to marry without satisfying the prior contract. The church broke into noise. Me stopped in the middle of the aisle. She was aware of every person watching her, aware of Ruth behind her still holding the remainder of the bouquet ribbon, aware of Tobias standing frozen at her side, aware of Frederick Crane rising from his pew with a hand already going to his own document case, aware of Clayton turning to look at Whitmore with an expression that was not anger but something more dangerous, the focused attention of a man deciding how to proceed. Reverend Prout said, in a wavering voice, "I'm not sure we can continue." "We can continue," Crane said, standing now, "because that filing is legally defective on 3 grounds and will not survive the week in any court in Texas." "My family's lawyers disagree," Whitmore said. "Your family's lawyers are wrong," Crane said. "I did not come here to argue law," Whitmore said, and he turned to me with the air of a man who believed the situation was fundamentally simple. "Miss Harper, your father was a man of his word. All I am asking is that you honor the commitment he made." Me had been standing very still in the aisle. The church was so quiet that the distant lowing of cattle could be heard through the open window. And into that silence, Clayton Atkins turned away from Gerald Whitmore entirely, as though the man were nothing more than a fence post that needed clearing, and he looked at me, only me, with 5 years of absolute certainty in his face. "Me," he said, "you know where I stand. You have always known where I stand. And I want every person in this room to understand something." The pause was enormous. I would have waited another 10 years for her. The words moved through the room like a current. Gerald Whitmore laughed. It was a short, dismissive laugh, the laugh of a man who finds sentiment irritating, and it was possibly the worst thing he could have done in that moment, because it clarified everything. It showed the room exactly what kind of man was trying to claim Mae Harper, and it showed me exactly what the alternative was. She turned her full attention to Whitmore. "My father made a decision without my knowledge or consent," she said, in a voice that carried clearly to every corner of that church. "He made it in fear, trying to protect me from a debt that was growing because your father charged him rates that were designed to make repayment impossible. I was offered settlement in full. You declined it, and I want to be very clear about something. She took a step toward him, not hostile, just present, just fully herself. You do not know me. You have never met me. You came here to enforce a contract that treats me as a financial instrument, not as a person. And I am telling you in front of every witness in this room that it will not stand. The church was utterly silent. Whitmore's expression had shifted from condescension to something more careful. Frederick Crane said quietly from his pew, "Mr. Whitmore, I have here a counterfiling that will be with the county clerk before the end of today's business, along with depositions from 3 lawyers attesting to the coercive nature of the original debt agreement and the defective nature of your court filing. I also have a check, drawn on Atkins Ranch accounts at the First Bank of Austin, for $820, representing full settlement of the original debt plus stated interest." He produced the check and held it up so that it was visible. "This offer expires at the end of today. Tomorrow I begin the litigation." Whitmore looked at the check. He looked at me. He looked at the room full of people who were watching him with the unified expression of a community that had made its judgment. He was many things, Gerald Whitmore, most of them unpleasant, but he was not a complete fool. He could see the math of this situation clearly. A prolonged court fight against Frederick Crane, against Atkins Ranch resources, against a defendant who had the sympathy of an entire town and at least 3 legitimate legal arguments on her side, and all of it for a marriage that the woman in question would oppose by every means available to her, was not a winning proposition. His father had been a man who understood when to advance and when to settle. He looked at Crane. He looked at the check. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he held out his hand. Crane crossed the room, handed him the check, and received in return the original contract and a signed release that Crane had prepared in advance with the thorough preparation of a man who had expected this outcome. Whitmore signed where Crane indicated. Then he straightened his collar, picked up his satchel, and walked back down the aisle of the church with the deliberate pace of a man trying to leave without looking like he was fleeing. He was, in fact, fleeing. The church door closed behind him. For a moment, nothing moved. Then Ruth burst into tears of relief, which broke the tension so completely that laughter rippled through the pews, a warm and somewhat hysterical laughter, the laughter of people who had been holding their breath for 20 minutes and were suddenly allowed to breathe again. Mae turned to face the altar. Clayton was still there. He had not moved. He was watching her with those dark eyes that had been watching her honestly for 5 years, and he was waiting, the way he always waited, with complete patience and complete attention, and not a single trace of uncertainty about where he stood. Mae walked toward him. When she reached the altar, she said quietly, only for him, "I'm sorry it took so long." "I told you," he said just as quietly, "I would have waited another 10 years. "You won't have to," she said. Reverend Prout, who had recovered most of his composure, cleared his throat. "Shall we continue?" "Please," Mae and Clayton said at exactly the same moment. The church laughed again, softer this time, warmer. The ceremony was simple and honest, the way both of them preferred things. Reverend Prout spoke about commitment and partnership, and the particular courage required to build a life in hard country. And it did not feel like a speech but like an observation, because everyone in that room had seen the last 5 years and understood exactly what kind of courage had been required. When Prout asked Clayton if he took Mae Harper to be his wife, he said he did with such directness and such absence of performance that several people in the pews had to look away, because the moment was too full to look at directly. When he asked me if she took Clayton Atkins to be her husband, she looked at Clayton for a moment before she answered, not hesitating but savoring, the way a person looks at something they have wanted for a long time before they allow themselves to have it. Then she said, clearly and without any trembling in her voice, that she did. Clayton's best man, his foreman Hector Garza, the son of the Pedro Garza whose wages Clayton had paid through injury years before, produced a ring that Clayton had ordered from a jeweler in Austin 6 months ago, a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone that Mae had once mentioned she loved when they were talking about color and the way the Texas sky changed in winter. She had not known he remembered that. She thought of it now, looking at the ring, that he had been listening so carefully for so many years that he had stored away even the small things, even the casual preferences, because to him none of it had been casual. When Prout said he could kiss his bride, Clayton put one large hand gently against her face and kissed her once, with everything in it, and the church erupted in cheering that startled the horses tied outside and carried through the July air all the way to the edge of the cattle range. The celebration supper was held in the hotel dining room, with tables pushed together and the cook working harder than he had in months, and the whole of Dusty Creek seemingly present in some capacity. Ruth cried again over the meal, composedly this time. Tobias Reed, who was growing into a young man of considerable promise, gave a short toast that was earnest and funny and made me laugh. Hector Garza played guitar in the corner, something he was unexpectedly gifted at, and several couples danced on the cleared floor at the far end of the room. Clayton danced with me twice, which was twice more than he had ever danced with anyone, and he was not naturally graceful about it, but he was attentive, which was better. She had her hand on his arm, and they were moving through the simple steps of a waltz, which she had taught him in the livery 3 days before the wedding during a lesson that had been considerably more entertaining than educational, and he had leaned close to her ear and said, "I was right about those extra rooms." She had laughed against his shoulder. "You are remarkably smug about that for a man who only just got what he wanted." "I have had 5 years of not being smug," he said. "I believe I have earned this." Frederick Crane departed the following morning, his case resolved, his check cashed, his reputation in Dusty Creek permanently elevated to something approaching legendary. Mae and Clayton stood together on the street watching his buggy pull away, and Mae said, "I need to repay you." "No," Clayton said. "Clayton, you said you wanted partnership," he said. "That was a partnership expense. We are square." She looked at him. "You are impossible." "You married me," he said. "You had advance warning." She had, in fact, married him, and the reality of it settled over the next days with the warm finality of something that has been building for so long that, when it arrives, it feels both surprising and inevitable. She moved into the ranch house at the end of July, leaving Ruth in charge of the store with a small ownership share that Mae had arranged specifically to ensure Ruth had real stake in its success. She kept the store, kept her involvement in it, spent 4 mornings a week there and trusted Ruth with the rest, because she was not a woman who abandoned what she had built, and she was not a woman who believed that marriage required her to. Clayton had never suggested otherwise. It was one of the things she loved about him. Life at the ranch was different from life above the store, in ways both practical and profound. Mae woke earlier, because the ranch had its own rhythms that started before dawn. She learned the details of the cattle operation with the same methodical attention she had brought to the store, asking questions until she understood the logic of each thing. Clayton answered every question without impatience, and sometimes with the additional gift of genuine interest, because he liked her intelligence and liked being with someone who wanted to understand rather than simply accept. The ranch hands were, collectively, an interesting group. Hector Garza, who was 28 and serious and competent, was also the person who kept the crew functioning socially, the mediator and the joker both, and he had clearly decided that Mae's arrival was a good development and made no effort to hide this. A man named James Whitfield, older, who had been with Clayton since the early days, was more reserved in his welcome but gradually thawed, helped along by the fact that Mae could cook better than anyone on the ranch, including the cook, and when she made biscuits on a cold morning in August and brought them to the bunkhouse, she secured the undying goodwill of every man present. September brought a heat break and cooler air from the north, and the cattle drives were active again, with Clayton's hands working long hours to move herds to market. Mee worked her store mornings and her household afternoons and evenings with the efficiency of a woman who was used to being fully occupied and found it comfortable. She and Clayton had fallen into the specific rhythms of shared life, the practical architecture of two people learning how to be with each other continuously. And it was not always easy, and it was never boring. There was an argument in October, a real one, about a business decision Mee had made at the store without consulting Clayton, which he felt she should have, and a decision he had made at the ranch without consulting her, which she felt he should have. The argument was heated and specific and entirely about equal regard, which was the same thing that all their arguments would ever be about, and it lasted one evening and was resolved the following morning with the particular clarity that comes from two people who are both committed to being honest, and both understand that honesty sometimes produces friction before it produces resolution. After the argument was resolved, Mee had said, "We are going to argue sometimes." "Yes," Clayton said. "And then we are going to resolve it," she said. "That's what I want. I don't want quiet avoidance. I want real resolution." "That is what I want too," he said. "Good," she said. "Then we are agreed." They were agreed. And over the following months, the pattern of their life together established itself with the particular richness of something built honestly, argument and resolution and laughter and hard work, and the thousand small intimacies of shared space, of learning another person's way of being cold in the morning, and their precise method of pouring coffee, and the subjects that made their face go quiet, and the subjects that made them light up. In the spring of 1879, Mee discovered she was pregnant. She told Clayton on a Sunday morning, sitting at the kitchen table with the east windows full of the particular gold of early spring light. She had been thinking about how to say it and had decided that the way she said everything was the right way, which was plainly and without preamble. She said, "I think we are going to have a child in October." Clayton had set down his coffee cup. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she recognized, the look of a man receiving something he has wanted for a long time and needs a moment to understand that it is real. Then he had gotten up from his chair and come around the table and pulled her gently to her feet and held her against him with great care, as though she were something he intended to keep. "Are you well?" he asked. "I'm perfectly well," she said. "I'm also going to tell you right now that I intend to continue working at the store for as long as I reasonably can, and that I will not be managed or handled excessively." "I know," he said. "Good," she said, and put her arms around him. The pregnancy was, largely, uncomplicated. Mee was healthy and practical about it, following the doctor's advice where it made sense and ignoring it where it did not. And she continued her store mornings until the first week of September, when Ruth firmly and lovingly took over her duties and told her to go rest. And Mee, who was by then large enough to find the storeroom shelves genuinely difficult to navigate, complied. The baby came in mid-October, a boy, arriving in the manner of first children everywhere, which is to say with considerably more noise and duration than anyone found comfortable, attended by the town's doctor and Ruth, and a neighboring ranch wife named Mrs. Elena Garza, Hector's mother, who had brought 7 children into the world herself, and had the precise calm of a woman who understood that birth was a serious business that benefited from experience. Clayton was in the room. Mee had insisted on it. He had been uncertain whether this was appropriate, because many men of the time and place were kept outside, but when Mee said quietly during a difficult moment, "I want you here," he had taken her hand and not let go of it for the next 3 hours. The boy was healthy and loud and had dark hair like Mee, and according to Hector, who was allowed in afterward, had the same expression Clayton got when he was calculating something. They named him Thomas for Mee's father. Clayton had suggested it without prompting, knowing what it would mean to Mee and wanting her to have it. She had looked at him when he suggested it, her eyes bright and her voice not entirely steady, and said, "Yes." Thomas. The name felt like a resolution, like laying something down that had been carried long enough. Thomas Clayton Atkins was a demanding baby who became an energetic toddler who became, by the time he was 3, a small force of nature with his mother's quick mind and his father's stubborn calm, a combination that made him simultaneously delightful and exhausting. He had the run of the ranch in a supervised way, following his father at a determined trot whenever possible, and Hector Garza, who had become his unofficial uncle, taught him to identify different breeds of cattle before he was 4, which Thomas reported to anyone who would stand still long enough to listen. The store continued to do well. Ruth's ownership share had been a good decision, as Ruth had both invested herself in the work and brought her own capabilities to it, and by 1881 Harper's store was the best supplied and best managed dry goods business between Austin and San Antonio. Mae had expanded to include a small lending library of books and periodicals, which was unusual and somewhat controversial and enormously popular, because the frontier was full of people who were hungry for reading material and had almost none. Clayton's Ranch, by 1882, was one of the largest operations in that part of Texas. He employed 14 hands, owned nearly 5,000 acres, and had developed a reputation for fair dealing and honest trading that made his word as good as any written contract in the region. He also, in a development that had not been entirely anticipated, developed a real friendship with several of the neighboring Comanche families who had territories to the north and west, a relationship built on honest trade and mutual respect that was not common in that era, and that both parties valued with the practical wisdom of people who understand that peace is more productive than conflict. Mae and Clayton had a second child in 1883, a girl they named Clara, who arrived more efficiently than Thomas had, and who demonstrated, from approximately her first week of life, an absolute certainty about what she wanted that made both her parents laugh with recognition. She had Clayton's dark eyes and Mae's precise manner of expressing herself, and by the time she was 2, she was conducting negotiations with her brother about shared toys with a firmness that impressed every adult who witnessed it. The years between 1878 and 1885 were years of building, the particular kind of building that is not about structures, but about the accumulation of a life, the layering of seasons and decisions and small kindnesses and hard work and laughter and the occasional genuine difficulty, all of it woven together into something that was more than the sum of its parts. Mae and Clayton had their arguments as they had promised each other they would, and they had their resolutions as they had promised each other they would, and the pattern of it had the specific strength of something tested rather than assumed. There were mornings when Mae stood at the ranch house kitchen window with her coffee, looking out at the land that was not the land she had been born to and that she had chosen anyway, and felt within herself something she could only describe as settled. Not the settled of resignation, not the settled of a woman who has given up wanting more, but the settled of someone who is precisely where they intended to be and knows it. There were evenings when Clayton came in from the range in the long summer light, dusty and tired and alive, and found me at the supper table with Thomas doing his schoolwork and Clara trying to do whatever Thomas was doing but with her own methods, and he would stand in the doorway for a moment before announcing himself, just looking at the lit room and the people in it with the expression of a man who understands exactly how fortunate he is. In the fall of 1885, Tobias Reed, who had gone from delivery boy to assistant manager of Harper's store over a decade of considerable personal growth, came to me one October morning with an expression of determined nervousness, and told her he had been offered the position of store manager at a larger general store being established in the new town of Kellerton, 30 miles east, and that he was considering accepting. Mae had sat down and had a long, honest conversation with Tobias about what he wanted and where he saw his future, the kind of conversation she had been having with him for years because she had always believed that the best way to lead anyone was to treat their development as a genuine priority, At the end of the conversation, Tobias had said, "I owe everything I know about business to you, Mae. Everything. You owe me your attention," Mae had said. "The knowing is yours. You did that." Tobias had taken the position and had gone on to be the most successful merchant in Kellerton, which became a regular source of quiet satisfaction for me, the particular pride of a teacher watching a student exceed the expected. Ruth took over as store manager in Tobias's place and ran it better than anyone, and the store continued to thrive. The winter of 1885 was hard, one of the worst cold spells in that part of Texas in memory, and the cattle suffered and the range was brutal, and there were weeks of genuine hardship when the cold cut through everything and the work was unrelenting. Clayton drove himself and his men hard through it, working to minimize losses, coming in at night exhausted in a way that went deeper than the body. Mae kept the ranch house warm and the food coming and held him on the worst nights, not with words because there were none useful enough, but with the solid presence of someone who is not leaving. They lost fewer cattle than any of the surrounding ranches, partly through preparation, and partly through the decision Clayton had made the previous summer to winter a portion of the herd in the more sheltered southern pastures, a decision that Mae had helped him think through. She had said, reviewing the grazing rotation with him in August, "What is the pattern when winter is early? Where do your losses cluster?" He had thought about it and changed his winter plan, and that change had saved them considerably. After the winter broke and the land began its slow return to color, Clayton had told her, sitting on the porch in the first genuinely warm evening of spring, "You saved us a significant loss this winter." "We saved us a significant loss," Mae said. He had smiled at that. "You never let me give you credit. I let you give me partnership," she said. "That is better." By 1887, Thomas was 8 years old and attending the Dusty Creek School, where he was, according to his teacher, both the brightest and the most difficult student, the two qualities coexisting in the way they tend to in children who are genuinely engaged with the world. He had his father's gift for calm assessment and his mother's impatience with nonsense, and he had decided, at some point in his 7th year, that he was going to be a rancher, which pleased Clayton enormously, and which Mae supported while also making sure he read widely and did his arithmetic and understood that having more than one direction available to you was not disloyalty to any of them. Clara at 4 was a small, determined person who followed me through the store on the mornings Mae worked there with the focused attention of someone taking detailed notes. She was already, with impressive precocity, asking questions about how the accounts worked. That year, in the summer of 1887, something happened that completed a circle Mae had not fully realized was open. A man came into the store one July morning who had known Thomas Harper in Missouri, a former neighbor named Andrew Claiborne, who was passing through on his way west and recognized the name above the door. He came in expecting to see Thomas and found me instead, and after the initial explanation, which was painful in the brief way such explanations always are, he had sat down at Mae's invitation and told her things about her father she had not known. He told her that Thomas Harper had been, in Missouri, considered one of the most honest men in his community. He told her that he had been adored by his wife, Mae's mother, and that her death had broken something in him that had never fully healed. He told her about a kindness Thomas had done for the Claiborne family during a hard winter, a significant kindness, the kind that did not advertise itself and was remembered for decades. Mae had listened to all of it with the full attention she gave everything, and when Andrew Claiborne had finished and excused himself to continue his journey, she had stood behind the counter for a long moment with her hand flat on the cool wood surface. She had forgiven her father fully and completely a long time ago, but this felt like something additional, like the story becoming rounder. Like Thomas Harper, getting to be complicated and whole in her understanding, rather than only the man who had made a frightened decision at the end of his life. She went home that evening and told Clayton about it as she told him everything, and he had listened with his characteristic complete attention and said, "He raised you. Whatever else he did, he raised you. I think he was mostly getting things right." Mae had looked at her husband. "You are a kind man, Clayton Atkins." "Do not spread that around," he said. "I have a reputation to maintain." In 1889, Mae's store and Clayton's ranch were both so well established that they found themselves, for the first time, with something they had not previously had in any reliable quantity, which was leisure. Not idleness. Neither of them was built for idleness, but the specific luxury of choosing occasionally to do something for no purpose other than pleasure. They began in the late summer of that year to take a ride together every Sunday evening, after supper just the two of them, out to the east pasture where the land rolled away and the sky was enormous. They did not always talk. Sometimes they rode in the comfortable silence of two people who do not need to fill space with words, who can be present to a thing together without narrating it. It was on one of those rides in September of 1889, with the evening light going amber and the cattle grazing quietly in the middle distance and the smell of grass and open air all around them, that Clayton said to me without preamble, "I think about that morning sometimes. The church." Mae looked over at him. "What do you think about it?" "That I meant it," he said. "Every word. I would have waited 10 more years, 20. I would not have stopped." "I know," Mae said. "I have always known that about you, that you do not stop." "Were you ever afraid of that?" he asked. "My persistence." Mae considered it honestly, as she considered everything. "No," she said. "I was afraid of the situation." "I was never afraid of you." She paused. "You were the clearest thing in a very confused time. Even when I was keeping my distance from you, I knew exactly where you were and exactly what you were. That was not frightening. That was the opposite of frightening." He reached over without looking at her and took her hand, the way he did sometimes when they were riding, a single deliberate contact. They rode the rest of the way to the fence line and back in the amber evening light, hands linked between their horses, and the land was wide and real around them, and the sky was enormous. By 1890, Dusty Creek had grown considerably from the small arrangement of buildings it had been in 1873. It had a proper hotel and a telegraph office and 3 churches, and a school that had expanded to 2 classrooms and a train depot, because the rail line had arrived the previous year, bringing with it the particular transformation that rail always brought to frontier towns: more commerce, more people, more connection to the world beyond the immediate horizon. The cattle trade had changed with it, the long drives north becoming less common as the trains took over the work of transportation, and the ranchers had adapted or not according to their particular capacity for adaptation. Clayton had adapted. He had been watching the rail expansion for years, and had positioned his operation to sell directly to stockyard agents in the nearest rail depot rather than driving north, which reduced his costs and improved his margins, and kept more of his men closer to home, which was better for the families that several of them had started. Hector Garza had married a woman named Isabel Ruiz in 1884, and they had 2 children, and the Garza family was as much a part of the fabric of Atkins Ranch as the land itself. Mae had stood up with Isabel at her wedding, which had been a warm and musical celebration at the Garza family homestead to the north, and the friendship between the 2 women had grown through a decade of neighboring and shared work into something genuine and lasting. Thomas, at 11, was beginning to show the specific combination of his parents' qualities in ways that were increasingly distinct. He had Mae's quickness with language and figures, and Clayton's patience with physical work and animals. And he had, additionally, a moral seriousness that was his own, the product of having been raised by 2 people who took honesty as a non-negotiable, and who had between them modeled the specific courage of people who say what is true even when it is difficult. Clara at 7 was a force in the classroom and a diplomat on the playground, managing the social dynamics of the Dusty Creek School with the confident precision of someone who has been watching her mother operate a small business since she could walk. A third child arrived in 1891, a boy they named Samuel, born in the spring with his father's dark eyes and his mother's will, who proved from his earliest weeks to be a quieter soul than either of his siblings. A child who observed more than he announced, who found the natural world absorbing in a way that suggested he might be the one to go in a direction neither of his parents had anticipated. The ranch was, by 1891, a prosperous and complex operation that employed 16 hands, ran more than 8,000 acres, and had a reputation that extended well beyond Dusty Creek. Clayton was not a man who sought prominence, but prominence had sought him, and he handled it with the same practicality he brought to everything, accepting the responsibilities that came with it and declining the pretension. There was a moment in the summer of 1892 that Mae would describe, years later, to her grandchildren, as the moment she understood most fully what she had built. She was standing in the kitchen of the ranch house on a Saturday afternoon, Clara beside her learning to make the biscuit recipe that had been Mae's mother's, and that Mae had taught her children one by one, and through the kitchen window she could see the yard. Samuel was sitting under the big cedar tree with a piece of paper and a pencil, drawing something with total absorption. Thomas was at the fence with Hector and his father, doing something with the horses that required all three of them and involved considerable consultation. Isabel Garza had come over for the afternoon and was sitting on the porch with her knitting, talking to whoever passed within range. The afternoon light was long and golden. The smell of biscuits was in the kitchen. Clara's small hands were covered in flour. Outside, Clayton said something that made Hector laugh and Thomas look up with a grin, and Mae watched her husband in the afternoon light, the same lean, competent presence he had always been, and felt the full weight of everything that had led to this moment. The contract that had tried to make her into a financial instrument, the death of her father, the years of keeping the distance while the love grew anyway. The morning in the church when the whole thing had nearly collapsed and had instead become the most definitive moment of her life. The 15 years of building, argument and resolution and partnership, and this specific Saturday afternoon in the Texas summer with biscuits in the oven and her daughter's floury hands and her husband's laugh in the yard. She turned back to Clara and said, "Watch the heat on those biscuits. You want them golden, not brown." "I know," Clara said, with the confident certainty of a 7-year-old who has been paying attention. "You do know," Mae said. "You're right." That evening, after supper and after the children were in bed, Clayton and Mae sat on the front porch in the cooling air as they often did, with the stars coming out over the Texas dark and the cattle quiet in the pastures and Dusty Creek's distant lights visible to the east. Mae said, "I was thinking today about that morning, in the church." Clayton looked at her. "So was I when I said that." "What were you thinking?" He was quiet for a moment. "I was thinking that everything that had happened up to that moment, everything, your father's death and the contract and the years in between and Whitmore walking in that morning, all of it had led to a moment where I had to decide what I was, not what the situation required me to be. And what I was a man who was not going to pretend that I could detach from you, that there was any version of the future where I simply accepted that someone else was going to have you. I couldn't do it." He paused. "So I said what was true." "You have always said what was true," Mae said. "You have too," he said. "Eventually," she laughed at that. "Eventually, yes." "That is not a criticism," he said. "You had to carry a great deal before you could put it down." She leaned her head against his shoulder, the way she had done on the store step more than a decade ago, and he put his arm around her, and they sat together in the evening quiet with the stars accumulating overhead and the land all around them real and permanent and theirs. "I would have waited," he said again, quietly, not dramatically, just stating a fact. "I know," she said. "That was never the question." "What was the question?" She thought about it. Whether I would let myself have what I wanted, whether I could trust that the good thing was real and not a trap. Whether after everything that had been arranged without my consent, I could choose something freely. She paused. I did. You did, he agreed. The night deepened around them, comfortable and full. Thomas Atkins grew up to be a rancher, as he had announced at 7, and a good one, and he eventually took over the management of the East pastures with the focused competence of someone born to it. Clara Atkins became a teacher, which surprised no one who had watched her manage the Dusty Creek schoolyard with such efficient diplomacy. And she built a school of her own in the town of Kellerton, where Tobias Reed had made his name, and she was considered one of the finest teachers in that part of Texas for the next 4 decades. Samuel Atkins became, as Mae had suspected, a naturalist, studying the plants and birds and ecosystems of the Texas interior with a rigor that eventually brought him to the attention of the university in Austin, and he contributed to the understanding of the region in ways that outlasted everyone who knew him. These futures were not yet visible on that porch in 1892. They were seeds, present but not yet grown, carried in the particular persons of 3 children asleep in the ranch house. What was visible was the evening, and the stars, and 2 people who had found their way to each other through secrets and contracts and patience, and the kind of love that does not diminish under pressure but clarifies. Mae Harper, who had been carried across a state by a father who loved her and feared for her, and made a terrible decision trying to protect her, and who had kept a secret for 3 years trying to protect the man she loved from being caught in her problem, and who had stood in the middle of a church aisle on a blazing July morning, and decided that what she wanted was real and that she would claim it, had built a life so full that the only word for it was abundant. Clayton Atkins, who had arrived in her store in the late summer of 1873 needing a specific harness buckle and had known somewhere in the specific quality of that first honest exchange that here was a person worth every year of patience it might take, had stood at an altar and said the truest thing he knew in front of the whole of Dusty Creek and had been right. He had meant it, every word. He would have waited another 10 years for her. He had not had to. And that was better than anything. The stars over Dusty Creek, Texas, were numerous and clear, the way they were in that time and place, before the electric lights would come and change the sky. They stretched from horizon to horizon in the particular abundance of a sky that has not yet been diminished, and underneath them the town hummed with its small and specific life. The hotel and the telegraph office and the school and the store with its lending library, and on the east edge of things the ranch house with its lit windows going dark one by one as the household settled into sleep, and on the porch the 2 of them still, not talking now, just present to the night. Later, when they went inside and the porch lamp was out and the house was still, Mae lay awake for a few minutes in the dark thinking about nothing in particular, the pleasant, unspecific thoughts of a woman who is tired in the good way, the way that comes from a day full of real things. Beside her, Clayton's breathing had already slowed into sleep, the deep, reliable sleep of a man whose conscience is clear and whose work is honest. She had thought once, years ago, standing in the store after reading Gerald Whitmore's letter, that she did not know whether the ground beneath her feet was solid. It was solid. It had been solid all along, underneath the fear and the secrets and the arranged contracts and the careful distances. It had been solid because of what she had built on it, day by day and decision by decision, and because of the person lying beside her who had known that, even when she had not, and had waited with the patient certainty of a man who understands that some things are worth any length of time. Mae Harper Atkins closed her eyes. The night outside was enormous and full of stars, and the land was quiet, and everything that had needed resolving had been resolved, and what remained was the particular beauty of a life that has been chosen freely, lived fully, and built to last.